Hello friends! Have you ever wondered what will happen if you end up overboard? We are not talking about a planned parachute jump, but about an unforeseen situation when a person ends up overboard wearing only clothes at great speed and height. How long can you survive in this situation? And is it possible? Who can dare to take such a step? Our story today will tell just about one such case. It happened under very strange circumstances to a man who did not expect it at all. This incident went down in world history as the only one for the entire existence of aviation. The reason for this situation will surprise you greatly. Be sure to watch this video to the end. On June 10, 1990, at 7:20 a.m., flight BA5390 took off from Birmingham Airport, England, to take passengers to Malaga, Spain. There were 81 passengers and 6 experienced crew members on board. The co-pilot Alastair Atchison handled the takeoff and soon handed control to the captain, 42-year-old Timothy Lancaster. There were no disturbing premises. The flight was standard. The team has already made hundreds of similar ones. 13 minutes after takeoff, the plane was flying over Didcot, Oxfordshire, at an altitude of 5,300 meters above the ground. The flight was normal. The pilots released their shoulder harnesses and relaxed, and the captain loosened his lap belt a little. Estimated flight time was supposed to be about 2 hours. There was silence in the cockpit after a few jokes. Smiling flight attendants began serving food to passengers. It was early in the morning, so many of them were preparing for bed and expected to spend the flight in peace and quiet. At that time, no one could even imagine that an ordinary flight would turn very quickly into a unique and very real race of survival. The Captain Timothy Lancaster had not yet settled himself in his seat when suddenly there was a loud bang. The human eye didn't even have time to register what happened. It all happened in a split second. The left windscreen, near which the captain's seat is located, just fell out of the aircraft body. The flow of air coming out of the plane with great force threw up and took 42-year-old Lancaster with it. He was propelled out of his seat and flew through the windshield, opening out of the flight deck. The man was pinned with his back to the fuselage from the outside, but fortunately, his feet were stuck between the control stick and the dashboard. There was a decompression in the flight deck. The flight deck door broke off and fell on the dashboard. The connection to the ground ended. At that moment, flight attendant Nigel Ogden was in the cockpit. He got his bearings in time and by inertia, grabbed the captain's legs tightly with his hands, trying to hold on to the chair with the rest of his body. I heard a noise, and when I turned around, I saw that the windscreen was gone. It has disappeared somewhere, and Timothy is slipping through the opening. He was sucked out so that I could only see his legs. The man later says, the co-pilot Alastair Atchison took control of the plane. He turned on the autopilot and tried to restore broken equipment and contact ground services. He couldn't do it. After a while, he saw the signal, but it was of little use. The pilot simply did not hear the answers because of the noise of the wind in the cockpit. It was a real chaos because nobody was ready for this. Meanwhile, the flight attendant Nigel Ogden was getting tired. He felt that he just couldn't cope alone, and he would not be able to keep the captain much longer. He gripped the captain's legs even tighter with the last of his strength. He shouted through his teeth and called the rest of the crew for help, who by then were in the cabin. Hearing the screams and finding that the doors just weren't there, 2 more flight attendants came running into the cabin. Despite their combined efforts, the captain slid out of the cockpit a few more inches, and only his shoes and ankles were in the cockpit. I grabbed Tim's legs, but I was almost sucked out of the cab myself. At the last moment, the flight attendant John pulled me back by the belt. In the cockpit, everything continued to be ripped and sucked. The oxygen tank that was securely attached almost blew my head off and flew away like a matchbox. I felt that I couldn't hold Tim anymore. I would have had strength for another 20 seconds, and thank God, one of the guys tied his ankle and secured it to the chair. It wasn't clear what to do next. Everything was flying and rushing around the cockpit. And most importantly, we understood that we had 81 passengers on board, and it would be very difficult to land the plane in such a situation. It was also not clear how much the rest of the class would last, because they could fly out after the first one, and then there would definitely be an accident. A few more minutes passed. Someone said that Tim would have to be released, but Nigel Ogden said he would never do that. He had no idea how he would ever be able to look the captain's wife and children in the eye again. Nigel himself was already developing frostbite. The crew was just sure that Lancaster was dead, but they were afraid to let him go. A strong wind could throw the body into the left engine and disable it. The flight attendant Susan Gibbons reassured passengers and asked them to fasten their seatbelts. The co-pilot Alastair Atchison began an emergency descent, then broadcast a distress call. Sometimes the captain's face could be seen through the side window. His eyes were open and did not blink, despite the strong airflow. In the end, the crew was able to connect the air traffic control. The co-pilot requested an emergency landing in London at the well-known Gatwick Airport. He could land there even with his eyes closed, but the ground crew decided to land BA5390 flight at Southampton Airport, which was much closer. 22 minutes after the cabin depressurized, at 7:55, Atchison successfully landed a plane on the second runway of the airport. It was decided not to carry out emergency evacuation. Timothy Lancaster was lifted into the cockpit and evacuated from the plane on a stretcher. Among the 87 people on board, 81 passengers and 6 crew members, only 2 were injured. All passengers left the plane in normal mode. Nigel Ogden was badly injured. He dislocated his shoulder, got frostbite on his face and left eye. Right now, he looked more like a SEAL team member who had just returned from a flight. Despite all this, he never let go of his friend. But the most amazing thing was that when the captain was dragged back, he was not just alive, he was even able to make a joke. The captain spent 22 minutes on board. At this time, the plane was flying at a speed of 600 kilometers per hour and at an altitude of 5,000 meters. Incredibly, Timothy Lancaster escaped with frostbite, bruises, a broken right arm, and fingers on the left hand. And despite all this, just 5 months later, the pilot was back at the wheel. After this incident, he flew a huge number of hours and at the age of 55, according to the rules of British Airways, was retired. He is married and has 5 grandchildren. The flight attendant Nigel Ogden returned to work after a short break. However, he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Because of this, he later changed his profession. The co-pilot Alastair Atchison, who landed the plane, worked in aviation for another 25 years. What was the reason for the separation of the glass from the cockpit? The investigation found that 84 of the 90 bolts that held the glass were too small in diameter, and the rest of the bolts were shorter by 2.5 millimeters. The installation of the new windscreen was completed just a few hours before the flight. The ship's supervisor did not check the documentation, but simply took the bolts similar to those installed earlier, estimated them by eye, and made a mistake by only one size. Friends, that's all for today. Write your opinion about this incident in the comments and rate the video. See you soon!